Thank you, everyone, for taking me at my word at trying to be back in your places. We want to get on with the program now and give Site Selection Group a chance to tell you all the findings of the study. Also want to do a few minor little housekeeping things. All the presentations that you see in the next day and a half will be available on our website, and we do have the shortcut to it now, but all the documents won't be up for a few days, but it'll be PCED, that's Pinellas County Economic Development, .org/2017 Symposium. So that's where you'll find all of the PowerPoints and the background materials for that. I also want to take a quick minute to just say thank you to the many people who put this event together. And first and foremost, I want to thank Cindy Margiotta. Without her help, this would not have happened, believe me. So Cindy, she kept us all on track, and I think most of the speakers have talked to her several times, so thank you for that. I also want to thank the rest of the Pinellas County Economic Development staff. I think we've got most of our office here today, and they helped out with every aspect of it. Want to thank the Ford Pinellas team as well. Wynton Blanton's crew was very helpful in this process and in the planning. And then, of course, the rest of Pinellas County government staff, particularly the Planning Department, the Development Review Services, and the Communications Department, were critical to getting where we are today. In addition, we had purchasing, OMB, the building department, Parks even was involved. Everybody has been involved in this process. I want to thank Nature's Table Catering for bringing us this fine food. You'll have breakfast again tomorrow, so that's a good thing. And of course, thanks to the Board of County Commissioners and County Administration for their support in this effort and for their attendance here today. Thank you so much. With that, I'm going to give it back to Josh and Chris, and we'll find out what they found out.
Well, now we can get to the good and exciting stuff here. And so taking what Josh walked us through before lunch, our goal with this project for Pinellas County is basically to replicate that process, replicate the process that we would use for an actual site selection process to both the broader Tampa region and also Pinellas County specifically. So you'll see how we've done that and how those sort of align with that process slide we looked at earlier. So first is coming up with project profiles. What are the types of aspirational or attractive industries and project types that Pinellas County would want, and those companies and projects would consider the community as well? Then, as we said, applying the same filtering that we would do for an actual project, but first to the broader region, because as Josh mentioned, us and other consultants, there's a mix between looking at a metro area versus running projects through the state. Our bias is identifying the metro areas, the broad economic regions that make sense for a project, and then tightening it to look where within those. So we want to see where the broader market comes out for these types of projects. In between those, just from the project standpoint, we visited the community, toured sites, met with employers, met with some of you probably, as well to understand your perspective, and especially existing employers, because in the process, and we'll talk about this in detail, the testimony of existing employers can be a critical part of the site selection process because they can tell prospective employers what it's really like to do business. So that was one key part of the community visit. And then finally, that in-depth site selection analysis, where if we were going from the metro area down to looking at Pinellas County, where would Pinellas County fall out for those types of aspirational projects? And finally here, we are presenting the report and the written report as well. So we started this project basically in late January, so it's about a 3-month process. So the project profiles. 3 main projects types that we wanted to focus on. One was a hypothetical corporate headquarters project. 300 jobs, nearly 6-figure annual average wage and salary, looking for either some square footage or a build to suit. Now, as Josh said, if there is, different criteria drive different projects. But in general, what we see on these types of projects, you'll see those drivers on the right. It's workforce availability and cost, tax climate, being in a large, fast-growing metro, real estate availability, and we did put incentives on this one because as you get further into the process, as Josh mentioned, incentives can play a role, especially for this type of project. Second, a financial services project with a specific focus on what we see a lot of project activity is technical skill, whether that's actually the finance and accounting side, but also IT. As we know, more and more IT, information technology, can drive projects. You'll see some of those same drivers on the right, but I'll focus your attention on that last one, that millennial demographic. And sometimes this becomes a little bit cliche and a little bit overused from time to time, but in actual projects that we see and we see in the marketplace, this is a consideration that corporate clients are looking for. Where can they access young, smart talent? And finally, a hypothetical advanced manufacturing project. 250 jobs, 50,000 in average wage. Specifically, and I don't think it's on the slide here, but something in the medical device industry, something that could potentially require some materials, some electronics, et cetera. Again, it's a recurring theme you'll see on the right there, and Josh mentioned it as well, but workforce is at the top of each of those, and that's what drives, in our judgment, the primary driver of projects. The other key ones that you'll see up there is real estate, having shovel-ready sites that are ready basically to go vertical. Either that or shell buildings that can be retrofitted for the need. In addition, logistics positioning. This is always a hard one to estimate for a specific for a hypothetical project because every company has different logistics needs. They're bringing down inbound product from different places, outbound product different places, but we hypothetically looked at a project that would need port access and would be serving the US population. And then of course, workforce training is critical in advanced manufacturing, as is utilities. So here we have yet another process slide that we like to use to walk you through how we would do kind of this first stage analysis. And again, no two projects are alike. Some come in with a geographic preference or a bias, some are looking nationally. But where we typically start is we start with every metropolitan and micropolitan area in the United States. 917, they've just added a few, so it's 930 at this point. Then we typically apply some type of market size. Now, some projects and requirements are going to want to bias towards larger markets, some in smaller markets. But based on their requirement, we'll look at what makes the most sense. But we typically do a filter here on this parameter. Then geography, and this can play a critical role, especially in manufacturing, is identifying broadly the locations, the geographic regions that make sense based on their logistics profile. That's inbound product and outbound. But at the same time, this is also a parameter that comes around in financial services and headquarters projects as well, when oftentimes you see companies escaping California or escaping New York, New Jersey to come to fast-growing Sunbelt communities, whether that's in the Southeast or in the Texas or other environments as well. This is where we start doing the analysis, using data to understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of all these markets. And we'll apply a series of filters, typically focused around whether that's logistics or workforce availability or demographics, to continue filtering down. Based on what we have at that point, oftentimes we'll apply either our own expertise to identify markets that might make sense for a project, and oftentimes our clients' operational expertise. Perhaps they operate in one market that they had a very positive or negative situation with in the past. So we'll apply those. And as Josh mentioned earlier, at the end, what comes out is anywhere from 5 to a dozen or so markets that we'll perform an in-depth analysis on. A lot of small type here, and we're certainly not going to go through all these, but a sampling of some of the variables that we would use to filter. Some of these are broad economic and labor market indicators, unemployment rates, population, growth rates, et cetera. Occupational profiles, which locations have a strong presence or concentration of the key skill sets, and projected growth. Current labor demand, if everyone is hiring in a market, are these clients going to be able to compete there? Again, you see the target age groups of if there's a certain age profile or education profile, operating costs, tax rankings. Essentially, we try to be as comprehensive as we can possibly be, applying all these variables, weighting them appropriately based on the specific project. If workforce is the biggest driver, we weight those variables more. If logistics is more important, we weight those variables less. But as you see, taking a lot of information coming out into a couple of key scoring metrics that we'll use both for our own projects, but for this exercise as well. So let's go to the community filtering results, the first big reveal, I guess. But one, for a headquarters operation. And you'll see on the top of each column is the broad weight that we use for each category. So labor availability is 25% of the total score, and that's consisted of demographics and occupational presence and a number of those variables. Interpreting the scores, and generally we use a method both for our corporate clients in this exercise as well, where we set 100 to be the average. So anything that's above 100 is generally positive, and anything that's below 100 is not as favorable relative to the comparison communities. Two big points here. One thing is, we like to focus on the total score, that 118 on the left for the Tampa-St. Pete's market. And that's certainly good, and that's positive, and we like to see that, and overall that tells us that this is a broadly competitive market for a headquarters operation. But the other thing, and we always like to counsel our clients as well, is look at the distribution of the scores on the right. Is there anything that is a significant challenge or shortfall? Because at the end of the day, we want our clients to be in locations that satisfy all of their needs. You know, if one place scores especially well for logistics but doesn't score well for labor, that's just something that's not going to work over time. But the first takeaway here is that overall for a headquarters project, this region should be pretty competitive and comes out pretty well in our kind of mock exercise. The second, and a pretty similar result for financial services, again, looking at the broad metropolitan statistical area of Tampa. And again, the total index score does well, and you'll see as there's a lot of green and light green shading to the right, there's no major, from a 30,000 foot level, there's no major challenge that would say, boy, this market just would not work for financial services. So again, overall, fairly positive at this point. Advanced manufacturing gets to be a little bit challenging relative to those other projects, and I'll talk through two key things that are highlighted there in red. Both that labor availability. Now, comparing this Tampa to every other market in the United States, including large markets, you know, the Atlantas, the Nashvilles of the world that have quite a bit of manufacturing and advanced production operations, in addition to some of those second-tier markets, whether that's upstate South Carolina or North Carolina or Tennessee, Kentucky, and the like, places that have a very high concentration of manufacturing skill sets. So as a result, this would almost be a little bit of a challenge thinking of how is the Tampa market overall going to come out of this filtering exercise. The other one, is talking about accessibility, and you'll see the score there doesn't really raise concerns, but on the back end, this is because Tampa is compared against every metro area in the United States. So it gets a little bit skewed because it does look better than putting a manufacturing operation to serve the US population in California or Seattle and the like. But as has been clear to us, and as the Congressman said, a peninsula on a peninsula, and just Florida in general, for meeting logistics needs of trying to find that optimal location to serve what the US population, Florida can be a little bit of a challenge, as you all know. So we're going to keep an eye on this one. And again, there's some small text here, but again, and we've talked through this on the previous slide, but the key takeaways on corporate headquarters is overall the Tampa market scores well, looks attractive. Where it doesn't fare as well, and this can be a little bit back and forth depending on the requirement, is how it compares on accessibility. Now, we've very much enjoyed coming into the Tampa airport compared to DFW and Atlanta and some of those major hub airports, and I see a lot of nodding that's certainly an advantage. Generally, for a headquarters project or something that requires a lot of people moving, there is going to be a bias towards markets with a larger airport. That being said, we have project experience both on the white collar and professional, or excuse me, the manufacturing side, where clients have preferred a smaller airport or a second tier or a non-hub airport just because it's so much more convenient than trying to get in and out of Atlanta and drive an hour north, if you're lucky, to get to your facility and the like. So, but overall on headquarters, from a broad filtering perspective, headquarters looks good. You'll see that in our analysis, we use this to also select comparison communities that we'll use in the second stage of this process. These are all communities that score very highly in our initial filtering analysis, or ones that we think have been particularly competitive as well. So you see some of the usual suspects up there, the Dallases, the Atlantas, Charlottes, Nashvilles, and the like. So you'll see at the next stage, these are the comparison communities that we've used, and we picked these because they are the most competitive. It's only through measuring yourself against the best communities to see where the challenges lie. Financial services, again, you've seen some of the results, and overall they're pretty positive for this type of project. Where we'll see a challenge both initially in this filtering and as we move forward, especially for Pinellas County, is if they're looking to target very fast-growing young populations, we'll see that the Phoenixes and the Planos and the DFWs and Atlantas oftentimes look more attractive, even if that's a trade-off with cost. And we'll go through that in detail. But again, you'll see the comparison communities that we selected for this exercise down there. Some of the same ones as before, but also some markets that have seen a tremendous amount of financial services and IT activity, Phoenix and Denver, for example. Finally, advanced manufacturing. Again, for a market in Florida, the overall market scores very well. What we'll see both our initial inclination and as we see this in the next stage of the process is geographic positioning. It's something that's it's going to be a challenge for Florida, so as a result, focusing on projects that make sense to be here. You'll see the selected communities, and they're sort of a different set than those first two. Those first two are really bigger, faster growing, Sunbelt communities. You'll see the ones on the right, we focus mostly on the southeast United States, but also selecting some communities that can be very competitive for manufacturing. That's the triad of North Carolina, upstate South Carolina, Greenville, Spartanburg, Huntsville, Knoxville, Lexington, Kentucky, et cetera. So smaller markets that from a manufacturing production standpoint could make a lot of sense for this type of project. So this is what we benchmarked against. So the in-depth site selection analysis. In our own work with corporate clients, typically there's any 10 to 20 separate analyses that we do, whether that's focusing on labor costs and talking to employers and figuring out what market wages are, or knowing who the competitors in a market are, or unionization rates and what shop is unionized and which isn't. But at the end of the day, we take all the data that we do, both off-the-shelf data and data that we do when we look at a community, and basically come up with two big analyses. One is a qualitative analysis. So this analysis tries to measure everything that it's hard to put a direct cost on. So things like labor availability, labor demand in a market, unionization rates, tax rankings, things. We want to measure everything that can influence a site selection decision but doesn't have a direct cost side. And on that note, the other side is trying to do an estimated operating cost analysis. Again, what is it going to take to operate this facility, typically over 5 or 10 years, and how is that going to compare? Both of these analyses, as we get further down the process, get more and more refined. When we do our first operating cost analysis for 15 markets, we'll come up with some results, but as we get deeper into the process, once we've identified specific sites and understand what those sites are going to cost, what the tax rates on those sites are, what the wage differential on this side of the county is versus the other side of the bay, we refine these again and again and again. A couple key points as we walk through the results. We often counsel our clients to strike a balance between these. And obviously some projects are going to be more cost motivated and some are going to be more quality motivated, especially as it comes to workforce. And we'll see this a little bit in the results as we go forward. But oftentimes there's a big trade-off between cost and quality, and it's important to understand, for a client to understand what's driving that. The second, and you'll see we do a little bit of a switch here. We've gone from our big filtering model down to identifying specific competitive sites within markets and starting to apply real commute times and real drive times around those sites. So what is it going to be like from a quality perspective to operate in the North County here versus Tampa, or North County here versus north side of Atlanta and the like. So we switch to actually get to the real economic areas within an analysis. So headquarters. From an operating cost perspective, and again, these are mock projects and every project is different, but these results generally make a lot of sense to us, that Pinellas County and Tampa overall sort of fall in that middle between some high cost markets, higher cost I should say, Dallas, Texas, Charlotte and the like, but some of those competitive markets in kind of the middle of the United States, Nashville, Indianapolis and the like. This doesn't surprise me one bit, and overall compared to some markets, it's obviously going to be a little bit more expensive, and the inverse on the other. For the operating cost analysis, we essentially use the county to estimate, one point in the county to estimate land costs and tax rates and wages and the like. You'll see in the qualitative analysis that we also wanted to benchmark different locations within the county. So we selected a northern, a middle, and a southern site to benchmark those across those kind of qualitative parameters. And in some cases, for example, the tax climate scoring is going to be pretty similar, if not the same. But those demographic profiles and occupational profiles are going to be a little bit different. And again, you'll see we benchmark this against Tampa as well. But overall, what you'll see here, and again, one point we really want to emphasize, and I'll say it again, is that we've selected these comparison sites not because they're easy to beat, but to show just compare Pinellas County and the Tampa region against some of the most competitive sites and locations in the country. I mean, if you've watched the news, the headquarters moving to Dallas-Fort Worth, especially North Plano, this doesn't surprise us one bit that Dallas would score really well, especially when you start talking about demographics and occupational presence and accessibility because of the airport there and the like. And you'll see exactly what we were talking about a moment ago is that trade-off between the qualitative side that right now Dallas can offer companies a lot of amenities and the like, but it's progressively becoming a more and more expensive market. So there's always a trade-off between those. As we look further down, looking at the results for Pinellas against these specific communities, you'll see that although they fall a little bit below the other ones, in general, they're still fairly competitive, but you'll see a little bit of the weakness in terms of the broad demographics compared to a Plano, compared to Charlotte and north side of Atlanta and the like. And that comes out a little bit in the occupational and industry presence. So is a headquarters operation going to be able to identify all the skill sets that they need here relative to a fast-growing place? Again, Dallas, Nashville, Atlanta, and the like. Moving to a financial services project. And we've switched the real estate requirement here that's more positive for Pinellas County is looking at rental rates here versus Tampa and what is coming online as well. And again, the result here is certainly positive, that from an operating cost perspective, compared to some of these very fast-growing markets, there's a potential cost advantage here, which is certainly positive. But you'll see that in the big trade-off here with the qualitative analysis of looking at, there's a reason why folks, again, go to the Dallas and Charlottes and Atlantas of the world, because those workforce demographics. And again, we've pumped up the weighting here on accessing a millennial demographic, accessing young IT talent. And that's where some of the challenges is comparing yourself to some of those markets where the Phoenixes of the world that continually announce big financial services and IT projects and the like. Again, we're comparing Pinellas and the Tampa region against the most competitive markets in our judgment. And finally, advanced manufacturing. So again, there's a little bit of a tighter bound here on operating costs, and Pinellas is a little bit more expensive than all these markets. What's driving the cost in this model is two big things. One is cost of real estate in this market, because and we'll talk more about this in a moment, but there's limited industrial land that's ready to go, and what is potentially available could be very expensive versus land in Lexington or Knoxville or the like, where you could find decent industrial land for $30,000, $40,000 an acre, or free, and we'll talk about that as we get into the incentives conversation as well. The other thing that's driving this cost difference for Pinellas County is estimated logistics cost. Again, and we've said it before, we'll say it again, it's the peninsula on a peninsula, where if an operation was trying to serve U.S. markets, whether that's the Eastern Seaboard or the broad United States or U.S., Canada, and the like, it just starts getting more expensive as you get further away from that centroid that's usually, depending on the project, usually somewhere in Tennessee or North Georgia or Kentucky or the like. It's always a tough one to estimate on hypothetical projects like this, but we wanted to include this just to say that this is something that this community is going to be sensitive to in attracting advanced manufacturing jobs. The qualitative analysis, again, you'll see at the top some of the most competitive markets for industrial projects right now. That's suburban Atlanta, upstate South Carolina, again, Greensboro, the triad of North Carolina, who strike that balance between manufacturing hubs with also being able to serve be attractive logistically. From Pinellas County's perspective, in general, the workforce demographics for advanced manufacturing and the occupational presence are pretty positive here, and that's in part due to the strong manufacturing base that does exist here, and something that is critical for attracting both expanding industry and new manufacturing operations going forward. What you'll see there in bright red as you go over to the right is that accessibility score, both measuring it from a cost perspective above, but a kind of a qualitative, how close are you to markets, how close are you to ports, and the like. That's where just manufacturing can be a little bit of a challenge here, and as a result, why it's important to focus on advanced manufacturing that makes sense, that has a reason to be here, whether it's to serve markets or to access a specific workforce or the like. In addition, and I mentioned how when we do an in-depth analysis, we do a number of analyses, but they break down into those two big ones. For this engagement, we also did two specific analyses on both real estate and incentives. And I think in our judgment, the real estate one is probably far more important than the incentives conversation that we'll have in a moment here. But it's to get a sense of what are the real estate strengths and weaknesses of this particular market relative to some of these competitor markets and our experience. We've broken down a lot of analysis into one slide here. And overall, we've grouped corporate headquarters and financial services, essentially locations either needing a small piece of land or Class A office space. What we see as strengths is that there is baseline availability here. If you had a project that was looking for a specific requirement, there are options here to satisfy those. In addition, and this came up in the operating cost analysis as well, is that those are competitively priced, especially compared to very fast-growing places like the Dallases and Atlantas of the world. And what we see and what we're positive about is that potential development in the pipeline, what is planned and what could have an office component going forward. Areas of concern, and relative to what we'll talk about on the manufacturing side here in a moment, it's a little bit, it's not as critical, but again, making sure that there are either land development options or existing office space options in other parts of the county, not just in the Carillon area. And then compared to the Tampas of the world or places where you can do, where there's easy land access, just the sheer number of options, both existing and future options. So overall, we think there's baseline availability for these types of projects here in the community, and that makes us feel positive about the prospects on this front. But in time, it's going to be critical to ensure that that pipeline of future office space or mixed-use space remains available. If we're being blunt in one part of this presentation, it's on the strengths of manufacturing real estate. And frankly, that it's a challenge here. I mean, especially when compared to other competitive markets for manufacturing. The Airco site, the golf course next to the airport, in time with investment, we think could be an incredibly competitive site, especially for a requirement that needs runway access or wants to take advantage of that kind of unique geographic positioning to access all of Pinellas County and the Tampa side as well. But across the country, industrial real estate and existing buildings is tight, and it's tough to find existing buildings. So as a result, what makes some markets stand out better than others is those shovel-ready sites that are truly ready to go vertical and to meet the speed to market requirements of manufacturing options. We'll talk about incentives here. And again, I echo Josh's comments that from time to time, incentives tend to make themselves out as a bigger deal than what they are in the actual site selection process, at least early on in the process. But as part of this engagement, we wanted to kind of benchmark what would a potential incentives offering look like here compared to some of these comparison markets that we've looked at. So again, there's quite a bit of information up there that you can read later at your leisure when the presentations are available. But let's look at kind of our competitive assessment of what local incentives would look like here compared to some of these markets. Again, one of the largest local incentives that you see is some form of property tax abatement or fee in lieu of payment. A lot of markets offer these. Some states have their hands tied on offering property tax abatements, but this is something that would be potentially offered for these types of high impact projects here. In addition, being able to expedite permits is something that would be potentially offered for these types of projects. Again, commonly used local incentives. What we often see sometimes for competitive local incentive offerings is waiving costs and the like. And it's always hard to judge this at a broad level, looking at a whole county, because it can vary from municipality to municipality. But in working with the folks at the county, we understand that there are municipalities and communities that would offer these kind of resources. And then finally, local workforce development support. Very competitive communities have gotten very creative with how they use local workforce development support and their local community technical schools and four-year colleges as well. And in kind of the baseline offer, we're giving this a little bit of a check minus right now, just because that initial offer only focuses on currently unemployed, where some of the more very competitive communities around the country find ways to do basically one-stop shop workforce training, screening, hiring, incumbent worker, initial worker training, and the like. These next two, and our intention here is not to say that this county or these communities should start giving away free land and writing checks to buy projects. Our intention on these next 2 points is to say that there are communities out there that do offer, whether that's discounted rent, free land, various types of public space improvements for very high impact projects. And frankly, for this exercise, it's a little too hypothetical to talk about what would actually be offered, but our intention here is to say that yes, there are communities that do this. It doesn't necessarily make them competitive communities, as the old saying in economic development goes. Incentives don't make a bad place good. They can make a good place better. And finally, from what you see, especially on highly competitive local offers, is some form of cash grant, forgivable loan, and the like. And again, our intention is not to say write a check to buy projects, but to know that for certain types of competitor communities, this is an asset that folks do use. We also looked at what hypothetical incentives would look like from partners. That's mostly the state of Florida, but also your friends at Duke Energy and the like. And here we see right now in the state of Florida, generally we think these would be pretty competitive state incentives for these types of projects, the headquarters, financial services, and manufacturing and the like. Again, it's always difficult in a hypothetical exercise to really make that true apples to apples, but based on our experience and looking at other real projects that have happened both in Florida and in other parts of the country in those competitor communities, in general, the baseline and moving forward, a competitive and a very competitive offer are going to be options here. So we don't see this as a weakness. Why we have a check minus up there on the competitive state incentive package in terms of a refundable tax credit. And this is a challenge with mature markets and higher cost markets compared to rural communities, whether in Florida and other states as well, that you do run into wage thresholds, especially for manufacturing. Even if wages are paying $50,000 or $60,000 a year on average, sometimes those might not reach the threshold necessary for state incentives on these types of programs. It happens from time to time, and in this case, we've talked about whether a potential waiver would be available, and so that's why we're not terribly concerned about this, but it's something that exists. And I mean, we could have a series of conversations and seminars about the efficacy of cash grants and closing funds, governor's closing funds from the state, but right now it is something that could, for a high impact project, is potentially available. So I think the lesson here from our view on incentives is that A, incentives don't drive projects, but B, there is the baseline incentives here that don't concern us in terms of being competitive. As Josh said, it would not be a deterrent to making an investment here. So, summarizing a lot of information, a lot of the work over the last three months. But here's kind of the 4 buckets we'd want to leave you with based on what we've seen in the community is 1, real estate or product development. Again, to be competitive, to be more competitive in advanced manufacturing, it's going to be critical to develop land sites that meet the speed to market demands of companies. And I don't think we're in a place to help you make that. To what point do you make those investments all the way up to going vertical or just utilities and land prep costs and the like, but it's a critical consideration if advanced manufacturing is something that this community wants to have. And again, baseline office availability, we don't see office space as a significant deterrent to investment in the community here, but it's going to be important that the community does make strategic investments and ensures that office availability grows going forward. I think if you're playing Peninsula on a Peninsula bingo today, I think we're on about number 6 or 7 on that. But again, it's especially as it relates to production. Florida can be a challenge from a logistics standpoint, and being on a peninsula in Florida can be a challenge. As a result, it's critical that the community targets the types of manufacturing operations that have a reason to be here, both in this part of the world and this community, whether that's things that are higher value add as compared to their volume, some manufacturing that could access or could leverage runway access at Airco and the like. It's going to be targeting recruitment efforts on the manufacturing side that we think is really important to mitigate that logistics challenge. And then the second point on that is we've listed as true commuting patterns and challenges. And you will see throughout kind of the analysis is that the Carillon sites generally score well because they're able to access the Tampa side of the market and access a large portion of this county for workforce. But one thing that you don't see in the data is knowing that there are traffic challenges, that there are bridge challenges, that there's workforce flow challenges because of those bridges. And our only recommendation on here is that there is a value proposition, and there is for every part of the county in terms of supplying the type of workforce, whether that's North County, South County, or being in the center and accessing that bridge, and that employers can provide testimony that they are able to, and regardless of what part of the county they're in, they're able to get the workforce that they need. Third big takeaway here is broad economic development strategy. And this goes back to that graph that Josh showed earlier that showed the flow of projects from consultants like us and companies going to either a regional economic development agency or the state and having those projects flow to either the county or specific communities here. In our judgment, this is a critical factor, especially considering some of the flux at Enterprise Florida and in the Tampa Bay regional marketing efforts as well. You want to make sure that you are getting the leads and the potential projects that flow down from the state and the region. Folks like us are going to be looking at initially going to be looking at the broader Tampa region, but we want to know what all the opportunities are, whether it's in here or Hillsborough County or what have you. So ensuring that there is that broad marketing and that project management function that when inquiries come into either the state or the region, for the right projects that could be attractive to the company and attractive to this community, you end up getting a shot at. The second point on that, and again, there's plenty of posters over there about the sales tax and the like, but it's an important conversation to have in the community and to identify those potential funding streams for long-term economic development. And again, I'll repeat it, this is not, we won't get into the weeds of what is the best use of those economic development dollars, but again, given some of the product weaknesses, especially on the manufacturing front, is having funds in order to make community investment in things that are going to impact the whole county into the future. And then finally, and this is always the most subjective and hardest thing to kind of analyze and provide an apples to apples comparison, but having been here a couple times now working with the community, overall it's an attractive location. I think you all know that, and that's why you call this place home. But talking to employers, talking to folks who hire talent from out of this area to come down, talking to folks who've lived in other parts of the country, who've moved to this part of the world, it's an attractive place to live and especially to do business. And what's really important, we've said this earlier, is ensuring that especially those employer advocates, whether it's the big guys in the room or some of the smaller businesses, when there is a project lead or there is a project opportunity, that those prospects hear from existing employers to hear both the good side and the negative side of doing business here, and why business recruitment business expansion efforts by the county and your communities are so important, because it builds that relationship with existing employers and then leveraging those relationships for projects moving forward. And finally, and we've seen this especially on the financial services project that was targeting a very young millennial demographic, is the demographic challenges of an established, mature county comparing itself to the Planos and Atlantas and the Charlottes of the world, that demographics and labor markets are like turning a big ship. It takes a long time and a lot of effort. But ensuring that the messaging, that companies understand that there is that workforce availability, regardless of who you're trying to hire, whether it's IT folks in financial services or manufacturing and engineers and the like, ensuring that those potential perception issues are mitigated and the story you're trying to tell is clear to both existing and potential employers. So with that, last slide is just a question slide, so I'll leave this up for our kind of our impressions. So happy to move to any and all questions. And I think there's a microphone coming around.
Hi, I just wanted to get some clarification. Are you saying that there is a perception that we have an absence of millennials, or that we have an absence of millennials?
I think it's both a little bit, both, and especially this is why we talk to employers and why that's such a critical part, both in this kind of hypothetical process, but also in a real project as well. We've heard that from employers, and then the demographics, especially when you stack yourself up to some of those fast-growing communities, it's a little bit of both.
Thank you. Hi, Ken Welch. Thank you for your presentation. You touched on the true commuting patterns. You're talking about how great Caroline was, but there is the problem with the bridges every day. So how does transportation and our current position with transportation in the Bay Area play into the work that you do, and what's your perception?
So there's a couple things, and I won't call it a dirty secret of site selection or anything like that, but again, when you do an analysis looking at what are potential drive times around a site and positive results there, that's a good thing. But then when you talk to employers as well and they say this is a challenge, it's why doing the qualitative work and talking to employers and the like is so critical in the site selection process, because you don't want to get somewhere in that area and just not know about that problem. But what we're suggesting to the community is being able to make sure that the employers who deal with those challenges both have a voice in terms of transportation planning, obviously in the community going forward, but also are able to mitigate those challenges or explain to potential employers of how those challenges can be mitigated and changed over time. But again, it comes to the data tells you one thing, the conversations tell you another, and what you wouldn't want to happen is have the conversation turn someone off to say, I can't be here, everyone's stuck on the bridge all the time. So I was saying that employer testimony is important, but making sure that there's messaging behind that that's backed by real data and real anecdotes from employers to confront that challenge.
Has that scenario happened?
Oh. Oh, no doubt it can happen when the data basically doesn't tell you the whole story. And once you get further into the process and employers are saying or that you don't want to be here, or communities, broad regions against other broad regions saying, you really want to deal with the traffic in Atlanta? Are you sure? You want to do that there? Yeah, that happens all the time, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, and thank you for all the thoughtful considerations. I've got a question about the qualitative analysis, particularly with the two first industry examples. So I saw the direct correlation between the total scores and the workforce demographic. You'd mentioned that before lunch, how important that workforce demographic is, and you could see them kind of going down hand in hand. But then I saw that there seems to be, at least in the examples, like a reverse correlation between the tax climate in the overall scores, and then of course that'd be also the tax climate and the workforce demographic. Is that to say that the tax climate itself isn't all that important among the variables?
On your last point too, and one critical thing to know is that in these analyses, we weigh these variables differently. So you'll see that on the financial services one, we've weighed those workforce demographic and occupational presence scores very highly. So that's why you definitely see a correlation between places that have attractive demographics and that total score. It's not necessarily, I don't think there's any necessary correlation between those variables and tax climate. But to your point, it depends on the type of project as well, and what's actually, if tax is a significant concern to this potential project. In these hypothetical projects, it's a concern and something we wanted to include, but in our judgment, based on what's driving projects right now, it's demographics and labor force, and that's why those are weighted highly, and why there's kind of a correlation between the total score and workforce issues.
Hi. Could you talk to us a little bit about the impact of the loss of Enterprise Florida?
Oh, there you go.
Well, we try to keep pretty close tabs on what's going on in state economic development around the country, and I don't think anybody has any clarity of what's going to happen. I think anything that you hear is rumors, and I think that it's just that. I will tell you that we think very highly of Enterprise Florida from a marketing perspective and a project management perspective. And I can tell you with all of the confidence in my being that if you lose state level economic development marketing and project management support, the communities in that state are going to be fighting an uphill battle, especially when they're surrounded by Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina and Tennessee. Now you'll notice there's one thing I intentionally left out of that discussion, that's state level incentives. There's a lot of people kind of, the rumor mill, right? One of the big reasons a lot of folks think Enterprise Florida might be in jeopardy is some politicians' view of state incentives. I'm not as concerned about that. Let the politicians fight that over. What you cannot lose is project management support and marketing. And frankly, take that a step further. You can't lose it for the regional Tampa Bay either. I mean, from my understanding, the Tampa Bay Partnership has undergone a transition where they're focused more on policy than they are marketing and project management. And obviously, I'm not involved in those decisions, but again, I can tell you with a very, very high degree of confidence that the constituents of the Tampa Bay MSA, the Pinellas counties of the world, that's going to hurt the flow of investment to this county without question. And so, you know, as we talk about final SSG impressions, there are a lot of positive things about this county. And you put me in front of a jury and I can convince you that this is probably a pretty damn good place to be. There are two things that scare me to death. One is losing the state level economic development, marketing, and project management support, losing it at the regional level, and then the industrial real estate impediment. From my mind, those things collectively are far and away, have a higher magnitude than any other set of challenges that this particular county faces. Go ahead, and then we'll get this going.
Two quick questions. You mentioned the Carillon area. Did your analysis look at where are the other potential areas within the county that we should be looking at for potential industrial development and commercial development?
I'll let him touch on the commercial development. The answer is yes. When we conducted the site visit here, we scoured the entire county. I can tell you, on the industrial side of things, to our way of thinking, unless we're just grossly missing something, the most attractive industrial development option is the Airco site at the airport because it's the largest continuous tract of land that is realistic. Now, there are some challenges to it, and we can talk about those challenges. I think to make that truly competitive, there's going to have to be some investment in making it shovel-ready. Making sure adequate infrastructure is there, accessibility, making sure the site's graded. I'm not suggesting get into vertical development, but get it to where it's shortening that speed to market concern. I think that's critically important from the commercial perspective.
I mean, yes, exactly as Josh said, we looked at the entire county overall. And one thing we didn't touch on, and what we try to do in these projects as well, is put our blinders back on and put on how would we view this if we hadn't visited this community and hadn't been in it before, and doing your kind of desktop research on real estate availability and the like. And what comes up if you're doing desktop analysis on Class A office spaces is basically all, for these size requirements, is all in that area. And it's critical for both long-term development opportunities to ensure that there is opportunity that meets the growing population growing north and what does come on the south side of the county going forward. But when you do the research, both desktop and on the ground as well, it focuses on that area because that's where the availability is.
One other question. You touched earlier in the presentation on low-tech jobs. We have we have some communities that are geographically dispersed throughout the county where we have large populations of underskilled potential workers. So given what you have analyzed about our community, are there low-tech jobs that we should be pursuing to better engage those members in our community?
I mean, I think that's a philosophical discussion to have internally among economic development if that's what you're after. I mean, my personal feelings towards economic development is aimed at raising the wage base. And so instead of finding jobs to fit that skill set, I'm of the mindset of elevating the skill set to fit the jobs that you want to have. And again, that's a philosophical discussion. This gentleman's been waiting very patiently here.
Thank you. A bit of just clarification on the quality of life. I know you indicate that the community presents well, but in the data I saw percentages like 103, 105, where 100 is about average, I think is what you said. So from a perspective of presenting well, were there specific items that might be things that we could be targeting? Or just a bit of clarification.
Sure. Quality of life is always the hardest single thing to try to put a number on, especially when you're going early in a process. It can take a number of different forms. For this analysis as kind of a baseline, we've used kind of your classic of number of restaurants and number of museums and arts and those kind of things. From time to time, we have projects that have specific requirements of needing X number of Major League Baseball teams and golf courses and a million different things that sometimes shocks us of you're actually making a site selection decision off of this potentially. We include those types of things in those kind of preliminary analysis, but at the end of the day, it's perception of the community of what the client already knows about that community, and then getting them on the ground and seeing how they react to what they see in terms of both on the business side, but also the potential lifestyle that they would have here. And it can be a balance between a CEO who's making this decision who isn't going to come live here versus the operations manager who's going to pick up his family and move wherever the project ultimately lands. So we do try to use some desktop quality of life metrics, again, traffic, crime, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, we don't really filter on it, and it's getting on the community and seeing if it meets what they're looking for.
So this is kind of a follow-up to that. It's not meant to be a follow-up to that. I'm David Downing and would visit St. Pete Clearwater. We do all the destination marketing for Pinellas County. I say destination marketing because it's not tourism marketing, it's marketing for the destination, not necessarily for the tourists. My question to you is about the perceptions, and kind of dovetails what he was saying. Who did you ask and what did you ask? How did you describe this destination? As the MSA or as specifically Pinellas?
Again, it gets back to talking to employers as well, and what are their especially their challenges in attracting talent to both the broader, I mean, it's basically three levels, is perceptions of Florida, perceptions of Tampa, and perceptions of the county as well. And you ask the question and see where are the challenges. And in some cases, folks say, and it is easy to get folks to move here because they've been in Detroit their whole lives, and not to pick on Detroit, but, and this is a really attractive place to work and live, and the climate, obviously, and all that stuff. But then you also talk to folks of, especially hiring young folks who have the option of going to New York City or Chicago or, you know, kind of those millennial hotspots, if you will. And that's where you do hear that, yeah, moving to Pinellas County versus going to New York City can be a little difficult, depending on what you're trying to attract.
Sure, and what we do is kind of the same thing, but I guess I'm trying to get you to see whether you have the same results. And when we ask people about Florida, it's one answer. We ask people about Tampa Bay, which they interpret as Tampa, that's a second answer. And then third answer is about St. Pete Clearwater. I'm wondering if you've sensed any of that trifurcation, if you will, in perceptions. Because this is the most difficult thing about marketing this destination. From Tarpon Springs to Fort DeSoto and the 20-something communities we have, the truth and the actuality is so different depending upon where you're talking about. It's very unlike some other destinations. It's very unlike Tampa itself, which is mostly Tampa and the two other cities that 50% of the people can't even name the two other cities in Hillsborough County. So this is something that we work with on a daily basis, and I'm wondering whether it was factored into how you approach this, because it's for us, it's a real challenge. There's an answer.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly make up something that sounds halfway intelligent here. From a quality of life perspective, I could make the argument that drawing that discernible difference between Tampa and Pinellas County in the realm of corporate investment really isn't that important. So I don't think we spent a lot of time doing that. I think from a business environment perspective, and that includes all of the site selection drivers, we certainly did draw a discernible difference between the two. And I think that did shine through when we were talking to people. And when we say talking to people, it's mainly employers. And the reason that we're talking to employers is because the testimony of theirs is going to far outweigh anything else anybody else could say when a prospective company is looking to cite a project.
Hello. Do you have specific recommendations for countywide investments that could enhance competitiveness?
I really don't like telling government how to spend their money. I can tell you, well, without question, if you hired me to do economic development in Pinellas County, I would make a very strong push to overcome the industrial real estate impediment. And I think that that's infrastructure related, and from a utility perspective and a roads perspective on one key site in particular, and the county happens to own that site already, which makes it even that much more easy. I think that would be my first recommendations to allocate funds. Again, this is it gets into the philosophical debate of how do you spend money for economic development? Is it incentives? Is it product development? I'm firmly in the camp that you're going to get more bang for your buck in product development. Now, product development is real estate, it's infrastructure, it's workforce, it's those sorts of things, and your allocation depends on your budget and depends on your constituents. But I would start with overcoming that industrial impediment, because that's, in my mind, the biggest challenge.
Yeah, just real quick, just on that point, one of the concerns you have is, as you all are looking at the different MSAs around the area, that you're looking at the Tampa Bay area. You're not really even looking at Pinellas County in the early stages. So how do we present as a Tampa Bay area, and what can we do? Do you see some problems with us as a unified group in accessing? The second question would be along the lines of that Airco property that we were talking about. How far should we develop horizontally? Because you can spend X dollars, but we want to get it more shovel ready. How far in that horizontal development should we go?
I understand.
Thank you.
The first part of your question is, that's one of the reasons that terrifies me, what's going on with the Tampa Bay partnership. It's going to be very, very difficult for a county of this size to come up with the appropriate funding from a marketing perspective to drive activity here. You rely on those regional and state partnerships, and that's why I'm terrified of that. Secondly, and I don't know if I adequately addressed that question. If I didn't, I can immediately after this. On the Airco site, from a development perspective, with public funds, I certainly wouldn't touch vertical development, right? You're going to stop short of there. If it was me, I would make sure that you have adequate utilities to the edge of the site. I would make sure that you have adequate ingress, egress to the property. I would make sure the site is graded, and I would make sure that all of the necessary assessments, environmental, geotechnical, all of those sorts of things are complete, to where all a prospective company has to do is submit plans for development, get approved, and start turning dirt. Road infrastructure, not on the site though. I would not do anything that would influence, or I wouldn't do anything that would limit the future use of the site. And on-site roads, I think, would do that. The reality is it doesn't take a lot of time to cut roads in an industrial park. Now, getting the broader ingress egress can be a big issue when you're starting to dealing with different highway authorities and the like. I'd make sure that's done, but I wouldn't cut roads in it.
Thank you so much. It's been very informative, and we appreciate it, and you'll be around for the rest of the day. Thank you.